don't think about the pink elephant. And of course, I'm sure you've thought about the pink elephant. It's the oldest trick in the book. That's one of the reasons why it works. So here is the challenge that European leaders after the Napoleonic Wars are going to face. They want people in Europe and around the world to not think of the pink elephant, to not think of the French Revolution. And history is filled with examples of people doing something like that, trying to roll back the clock and pretend like something that happened clearly never happened. History also tells us that in almost every instance somebody attempts that, it's an exercise doomed to ultimate failure. The Napoleonic War cost Europe roughly 7.5 million dead. If you look at the percentages involved, Europe lost roughly the same percentage of people that it lost in World War I. So the challenge facing the Congress of Vienna is twofold. One, how can you roll back the clock on the French Revolution and get people to pretend it never happened? Two, how can you make sure that another war like it doesn't happen again? Well, the Congress of Vienna is basically a conference that consists of the big five powers of Europe. So we're talking about Britain, France, Austria, Russia, and Prussia. And these are the powers that are, in many cases, literally going to redraw the map of Europe. So one thing they sort of immediately decide upon is the idea that there should be a relative balance of power. Yes, Britain has its navy. Yes, Russia has its enormous army, and so too does France. But no one European power can necessarily defeat all the others. So, in other words, there's kind of deterrence by the fact that power is more or less evenly distributed. They're also too exhausted for vengeance. They, if they had wanted to, could basically carve France up into four different parts and split it amongst themselves. But they don't do that. One of the reasons they don't do that is because France is really too large for any one country to control. But also, too, that doesn't seem like it's going to be stable in the long term. So the decision is taken that France should be rehabilitated. Not rehabilitated to the same extent that it was under Napoleon, but rehabilitated nonetheless. Also, it helped that the French delegation was led by Charles Maurice de Talleyrand, who basically set all the allied powers of Europe against one another, and it's a case of divide and rule. The great powers of Europe also agree that this shouldn't be a one and done kind of meeting, that they should continuously meet to ensure that the balance of Europe, or balance of power in Europe, is more or less preserved. These meetings and the organization around these meetings becomes known as the Concert of Europe. So again, in theory, it's designed to keep the balance of power in Europe. And in practice, that's more or less what it does. But it also doesn't just keep the balance of power between European nations, it keeps the balance of power within European nations. Because remember, the European powers are almost more afraid of their own people than they are of other countries. So in practice, the Concert of Europe becomes sort of like this of anti-revolution Avengers task force almost. That was the intention, at least. But, as we all know, intentions don't always equal reality. So, in 1820, there was a nationalistic revolution within Greece to try to overthrow Ottoman rule. Remember that basically the Greeks had been controlled or dominated by the Ottoman Empire since the Byzantine Empire's collapse in the 1450s. So, the Greek Revolution attracted the attention of people around Europe, and a lot of people who weren't Greek themselves, like Lord Byron, traveled to Greece in order to participate in the revolution and the struggle against the Ottoman Turks. So in theory, the Greeks should be told to shut up and simmer down if we're going to follow what the Concert of Europe normally dictates. But that's not what happens. What happens instead is that Great Britain, France, and Russia basically kind of forget that revolution is of Satan, and they all embrace the Greek revolutionaries for very, very different reasons. So Britain and France embraces revolution because they are sort of captivated by the theoretical liberalism of the Greek revolutionaries. Also, there's the coolness factor with Greece. It's the land of democracy and Aristotle and Plato and all these philosophers. The Russians just see potential allies because, remember, the Greeks are a fellow Orthodox nation. Also, they were just supposed to keep peace within Europe, and I suppose the loophole that they cite is that the Ottoman Empire isn't really in Europe, so it doesn't count these. So they all gang up on the Ottoman Empire. The British basically sink the Ottoman Navy, and Greece becomes independent. And it leaves Austria, which is the one country that really cares about anti-revolutionary activities, because basically it will be at the victim of revolutionary forces for its entire existence, very cranky. One of the things that you see in the Greek Revolution is the major powers are certainly all against revolution, except when they really want a revolution, or rather when that revolution directly impacts their self-interests. So what we find is that great powers tend to prioritize their own self-interest over suppressing revolutions. And you also see that in the Belgian Revolution of 1830. So the Congress of Vienna basically combined Belgium and the Netherlands together, which makes European geography much easier. The issue is that the population of the Netherlands is mostly basically Northern European. They're mostly Protestant. The province of Belgium, well, they're basically mostly Wallonian and mostly Roman Catholic. There are linguistic differences and cultural differences, but suffice to say, it was a kind of awkward marriage to begin with, and so the Belgian population starts a revolution. Now, at first, the Dutch really have the advantage because they've got the larger army, they've got access to state finances, but then France gets involved. France is also a Roman Catholic power, and they send troops to aid the Belgian revolutionaries, and the Dutch nope right out of Belgium, basically agreeing to an armistice called the Treaty of London, where most European countries formally recognize the split of the Netherlands and Belgium. But there is such a thing as karma, and in July of 1830, France undergoes a revolution of its own after King Charles X, who is the brother of King Louis XVIII, basically disbands the Chamber of Deputies because he feels like it. Not only does he do that, he does other things like he reimposes press censorship and basically limiting the franchise. In other words, limiting the number of people who can vote. King Charles X is kind of an old school monarch, one that probably made the Congress of Vienna very happy, but French people were not as keen, and so he gets overthrown and replaced with a much more modern king by the name of King Louis Philippe I. But none of these revolutions compare to the revolutions of 1848. This is where France undergoes this tectonic shift in its political orientation, and as a consequence, the rest of Europe basically goes absolutely bonkers. It is said during this time period that when France sneezes, Europe catches a cold, and probably the revolutions of 1848 best illustrate that. So, on the one hand, King Louis Philippe was sort of portrayed as what we call the bourgeois monarch. That can be both a compliment or an insult, depending on how you look at it, but by the standards of the day, he was kind of a modern man. He was an expert businessman and had actually accrued just by himself, really without royal connections, one of the most massive private fortunes in all of Europe. So, this was somebody who knew how to do business, who also understood the value of modernity and industrial technology. And his government was very influenced by bankers, financiers, and industrialists. But on the same level, only about 1% of France's entire population have the right to vote, since ultimately the only way you could vote is with land ownership. In France, you see the beginnings of a reform movement to expand the franchise, expand the right to vote, as Britain had done in the Reform Bill of 1832. But King Louis Philippe basically ignored all of that, and there were lots of gatherings that in France, gatherings, banquets, parties, where members of the political class began toasting the creation of a French republic. Eventually, the French government, led by King Louis Philippe's prime minister, actually makes those gatherings illegal, and that eventually touches off the Revolution of 1848. This ultimately topples the French government entirely, and King Louis Philippe is replaced with the Second Republic, at least for now. Eventually, the destabilization created by the Republic falls to the charisma of Napoleon's nephew, who becomes president of the French Second Republic, and then later on is elected emperor, Napoleon III. In Germany, the revolution is very, very complicated. So you have both liberals and nationalists who want a revolution for very, very different reasons. Liberals want all the German states, more or less, to adopt governments that recognize a constitution. They want to move their respective monarchies to constitutional monarchies. So that's the liberal side. Then, on the other hand, you have the nationalists, and the nationalists want Germany to unify as one country. Because remember that Germany has basically fractured, or has been fractured, let's see, since the collapse of the Roman Empire, basically. So you do have both a nationalist and liberal revolution in Germany, which admittedly is put down with a great deal of violence. Other revolutions include a nationalist revolution in Poland against the Kingdom of Prussia, and a liberal revolution concentrated mostly in northern Italy. Finally, you have a revolution in the Austrian Empire, where in 1848, the Hungarian population rises up, basically trying to establish their own right to self-determination. The Austrians are actually unable to put down this revolution. And in fact, the only reason it gets put down in the first place is because it's put down by the Russian Empire that sort of intervenes right at the most opportune moment. For the most part, these revolutions are considered failures because they don't topple many governments, except, again, the exception being France, and you don't see a lot of permanent reforms, but it does permanently terrify many European leaders and governments. So remember, the French Revolution unleashes two forces upon the world. The first is liberalism, which is, of course, the idea that the government really needs to stay out of people's business as much as possible. It's the belief that people are good, and if people are good, they should basically just be allowed to do their own thing. The problem with liberalism, at least according to its detractors, is that even if you accept that human beings are good and you should basically just allow them to do their own thing, the fact is that liberalism is so individually organized and so individually focused that it's hard to really have much state organization with a liberal ideology. You remember, if you look at the French Revolution caused lots and lots of chaos. And that chaos, to a certain extent, was associated with liberalism, because liberalism doesn't really get along well with or play nicely with others. That's a gross generalization, but we're talking about these ideologies in sort of generalized ways. So under Napoleon, it's almost as if the French Revolution shifts its fuel from liberalism over to nationalism. Now, nationalism is less concerned with the rights of the individual, is much more concerned with the rights of the group. So in other words, it is not concerned so much with the rights of any given French person, it is concerned with the rights of the French people. So we define nationalism as intense belief and pride in one's national culture, and it's usually associated with the territory in which that nationality resides, usually, not always. The other thing that's worth noting is that typically nationalism involves an element where you view your culture as inherently superior to others. Because I would say that Otherwise, this could just as easily be sort of a definition of what we would call patriotism. Now, nationalism, the idea that people in a nationality, a national group need to come together, usually has four common characteristics. Some national histories involve just one of these elements. Some involve multiple of these elements. It just kind of depends. But the most typical example is that nationalities usually have a common language. And we'll talk a lot more about that a bit later, actually. If you don't have a common language, like for example, in the United States, we have no nationally recognized official language. Now, there are lots of Americans who make the argument that we should, but the fact is that we don't have a nationally recognized common language. Instead, what you see, also, by the way, we don't have a common culture. What we do have is, after Manifest Destiny runs its course, we have a common location, more or less. But more importantly, we have common historical experiences, and also, along with that, common institutions. So, for example, you notice that when people swear an oath of loyalty to the United States, they don't swear an oath of loyalty to the sitting government or the president. The military, for example, swears an oath to defend the Constitution. The president swears an oath to defend the Constitution. So we revere the common historical experiences we have and also the common historical institutions. So why does France shift from liberalism to nationalism? Part of it is simple military pragmatism. So if you think about it, fighting for things like individualism, freedom of speech, certain constitutional rights, like that's great. But it's also very, very abstract. What is freedom? What is liberty? What is individualism? That's hard to explain. However, nationalism says that basically the people who share your language are your family. So with nationalism, it's very straightforward. You're not fighting for abstract ideas. You're fighting for your people, for people that are considered your family. So it basically makes the stakes very straightforward. Also, with conscription and nationalism kind of fused together, it means that French people are no longer fighting for the whims of a king. They're fighting for the French people. So, in other words, you can expect more loyalty and more reliability out of the troops that you conscript. So it also means that you can, frankly, conscript more troops. You don't have to be as worried about them being loyal to the government because they're loyal to the idea of French nationhood. They're loyal to the French people. This is why nationalism is such a major, really, where it's most useful is in warfare. It just provides such a major morale boost. And national armies versus like pre-modern armies almost always result in the national armies emerging triumphant. The dark side of nationalism, however, is I just said that France is the nation of the French people. Well, what if you're in France, but you're not French? You are loyal to the French state, you might be loyal to the government, but you're not French. Oftentimes, nationalism creates outgroups. And the French Revolution actually creates a major outgroup. There's actually resistance to the new revolutionary government in what's called the Vendée region of France. And because the revolution is such an important part of France's national identity, the French government responds extremely brutally. They send thousands of troops to basically repress the rebellion, and it leads to widespread destruction and murder in what a lot of historians call the first example of modern genocide. Nationalism also creates a ticking time bomb for other countries and their empires. So Austria-Hungary is now going to be living on borrowed time. As soon as other national groups, like for example the Hungarians, like we already talked about, but also especially the Serbians, assert their right to self-determination, let's just say that's going to cause some problems. In Great Britain, not only do we see the effects of nationalism on Britain's empire, especially in places like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, etc., but we also see the continued impact of nationalism on the United Kingdom today. Within the last decade, there was a referendum on Scottish independence, and Scotland voted to remain within the United Kingdom, but it was actually a very, very close vote. So nationalism will eventually destroy the British Empire, and basically it remains to be seen whether nationalism will rip apart the remaining United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. But just as nationalism can destroy, it also can create. And it is responsible for creating both Italy and Germany, which we'll talk about now. It might seem weird to think about, but the United States is actually an older state than Italy is. Which is, again, extremely weird to think about because we think Italy, we think, the Roman Empire and Florence and all that. But Italy is rather like Greece in the sense that Italians have always historically sort of associated themselves with their city or polis rather than being Italian. Italy was more of a geographical concept. It referred to the Italian peninsula. But there was no concept of an Italian culture or an Italian language, at least not a well-defined one. Italy was divided into 9 very different states with extremely different political traditions. And parts of Italy had long traditions of being ruled by foreign European powers. Like, for example, you have this area of Italy, which basically overlaps with where modern-day Venice is, for example. That's ruled by the Austrians. This area, called the Piedmont region, has historically been French or has lots of French influences, and the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies spends a large amount of time under Spanish rule. So Italy kind of becomes a football field for all the European powers to sort of settle their differences. Now, even if Italy does unify, there are all kinds of barriers to unification. The first is geography. So Italy has in its northern part the largest mountain range in Europe, called the Alps, but the mountain range that really vexed the ancient Romans and modern Italians is actually a mountain range that basically runs through the center of Italy called the Apennine Mountains, making it hard to get from one side of Italy to the other. And even besides the Apennine Mountains, Italy is extremely mountainous, hilly, and very, very rocky. So sort of like the ancient Greeks, this sort of promotes strong regional identities in Italy, which means that the culture of northern Italy, for example, is dramatically different than the culture of southern Italy. The other question is, even if Italy is going to unify, which state is actually going to unify it? There's also a complete lack of European support, as we basically mentioned. Almost all the great powers of Europe have tried to intervene directly in Italian affairs at one point or another. And one of those European powers, admittedly not a great European power, is, of course, the Pope. The Pope has this sort of Z-shaped territory called the Papal States, has since the donation of Pepin all the way back in the Middle Ages. So what is Italian unification going to mean for him? And the Pope basically concludes, well, nothing good. So those are some pretty sizable factors or barriers to unification, but there are also factors that support it. Firstly, again, it's geography. So this is the sort of other edge of the sword. Italy is sort of concentrated close together. The states have long-standing relationships with each other. There's also pride in heritage and the Italian culture, and this is sort of touched off by Giuseppe Mazzini, who is very often considered the father of Italian nationalism. He sort of factors in or channels Italian pride and old Roman virtues, talks about creating Italy as a rejuvenation of Rome, and then you also have the the coalescing of modern Italian into a unified language, more or less, in about the early 19th century. I do have to admit, though, that there is a dramatic difference between the cultures of northern Italy and the cultures of southern Italy. Always have been to a certain extent. But in terms of wealth, in terms of education, there's huge differences there. Finally, in terms of factors that support unification, Giuseppe Garibaldi, man. He puts together a band of followers called the Red Shirts, and he basically goes around throughout Italy trying to unify the thing. Finally, the Prime Minister of Sardinia Piedmont, or rather Sardinia Piedmont, Count Camillo di Cavour, leads the unification of Italy and leads the nationalist movement. So Italy gets unified under the kingdom of Sardinia Piedmont. It gets unified under the monarchy of Victor Emmanuel II. That being said, the Italian unification poses a great many problems. So, just like we talked about in France, the right to vote was limited to upper middle class property holders. So, you don't have universal male suffrage. The fact is that relations with the Vatican will continue to be awkward because they're basically still upset about the creation of Italy. There are disagreements over imperialism, whether Italy should become an imperial power. Spoiler, it does, but even when it does, to quote the great philosophical work known as Top Gun, Italy's body starts writing checks that it can't cash because Italy lacks industry and natural resources. Fundamentally, Italy is still a poor country, especially if you look at southern Italy, which causes sort of an Italian diaspora, which eventually leads southern Italian immigrants especially to places like the United States. But with Italian unification, an important thing happened. Nothing. I know that you're probably thinking that I've gone senile, and maybe that's the case, but nothing is important because remember, in the Congress of Vienna, the view is that if a European power becomes if a European state, rather, unifies or changes its government, then that's going to become a problem for all of Europe. And if it's a revolutionary type thing, maybe that revolution is going to spread. So Italy unifies, and the revolution doesn't spread to other countries or other territories. Basically, it's just business as usual. And that is remarkable in and of itself. And so a number of people are watching the Italian War of Independence with a great deal, or rather, Italian War of Unification, with a great deal of interest. None is more interested than Prussian statesman Otto von Bismarck. He's a big boy here. So let's talk about German unification. We also have to go back in time a little bit because there's something that Napoleon does that I didn't mention in the Napoleonic War lecture. So in 1805 to 1806, Napoleon wars against the Austrians, the Russians, almost exclusively. He beats them both at a battle called Austerlitz. And after the Battle of Austerlitz, Austria just kind of announces that it's done. Its army was completely destroyed. Vienna was occupied. Vienna's its capital. And so Austria just kind of wants to peace out. Napoleon says, okay, but if you are going to peace out, then you've got to do something for me. You have to take the Holy Roman Empire, the empire that's basically been in your family, the Habsburg family, since really the 1200s, and you've got to disband it. And so the Austrians do just that. And so in exchange, or rather in replacing that, you have this organization called the Confederation of the Rhine. And instead of Austria controlling that, France controls it. And being the head of the Confederation of the Rhine, Napoleon takes several dozen German states and he starts putting them together until you get 39 German territories. Now, that might seem like a lot, but if you remember how crazy and bonkers the Holy Roman Empire was back in the day, this is actually streamlining things considerably. And what's interesting is that the Congress of Vienna reverses a lot of what Napoleon does. They don't reverse this. They're like, this actually kind of makes our lives easier, so we're going to keep it at 39 states. At the end of the Napoleonic War, the Germans start rising up throughout the Confederation of the Rhine to push out French forces. So note that it's not just the Prussians or the Bavarians or the Saxons or the Württembergians that are rising up. It's all of Germany. In fact, this is called the German War of Liberation, and it's an incredibly important foundation for German nationalism. However, there are lots of barriers to unification. So if all the German-speaking territories come together and creates a united Germany, well, that is going to be a really overpowered country. Like, in one fell swoop, European power, which generally, like, the largest continental powers in Europe are going to be France and Russia, but with a united Germany, suddenly Germany becomes by far the largest and most powerful country in Europe. In terms of its industry, in terms of its military power, it just becomes real beefy. So all the European powers are nervous about a united Germany, and also there are internal frictions that really haven't been resolved from the 30 Years' War. The fact that most of southern Germany is still Catholic, most of northern Germany is still Protestant, and even at this time period, those distinctions still matter. Just like with Italy, there are lots of factors that support unification, including the fact that Germany has just had a war of liberation that's within living memory. You also have a common culture, and also that common culture is established by the literature of the era. One individual who really facilitates that is the philosopher, playwright, author, Goethe. Goethe is one of the individuals who helped standardize the German language during this time period. And a lot of scholars of nationalism will tell you that in the age before movies and radio and the internet, one of the primary ways for nationalism to spread is through literature. So respect your English teacher. When Otto von Bismarck observes the War of Italian Unification, what he sees is that Italy has a revolution. It's a nationalist revolution, but it doesn't become revolutionary. Its revolution doesn't spread to other countries, and Bismarck realized that nationalism doesn't have to be a tool of liberals. Nationalism can also be a tool of conservatives, of people who support old-fashioned ideas. And by the way, Otto von Bismarck was a major supporter of old-fashioned ideas. He was a Prussian Junker, which means he was a noble, and a conservative. He thought that the king's power in Prussia came from God and was beyond reproach. So even though Bismarck is kind of seen as one of the defining figures of the 1800s, his political beliefs almost come out of the age of Thomas Hobbes and the Divine Right of Kings. Above all, he wants to make the state of Prussia powerful. And in his mind, the best way to make Prussia powerful is to unify Germany under Prussian leadership. And remember, Prussia is considered the Sparta of the North. It has an incredibly martial society that is almost always prepared for war. It also has one of the most industrial societies, especially when you look at it per capita. So Bismarck's Prussia rather, has a few advantages. Its industrialization, its railroads, and finally its military strength. So Bismarck tries to unify Germany in basically 3 wars. The first war is with Denmark, where basically Prussia takes the territory of Schleswig-Holstein away from Denmark. Bismarck's kind of barely dipping his toe in the water, and what he discovers is that even though European powers might complain about it, they don't ultimately stop Prussia from taking Schleswig-Holstein. The next war is a war with Austria. Remember, the Austrians are one of the most conservative states in Europe, one of the states that wants the balance of power to be preserved as much as possible. Remember that the Austrians are also considered a German state as well. They've controlled Germany for the most part since the days of the Holy Roman Empire. Now that the Holy Roman Empire has been eliminated, Austria is feeling a little insecure about itself. And now Prussia seems like it's the most influential state in Germany. So the Austro-Prussian War is basically a war over which state is going to be the most powerful in Germany, Prussia or Austria. And in just 7 weeks, the Prussian army manages to just totally annihilate the Austrians, culminating with a major defeat at the Battle of Königgrätz. So after that battle, the Austrians sue for peace. They're probably expecting that the Prussians will take territory. But that's not what Bismarck does, because Bismarck knows that the goal is unification of Germany under Prussian leadership. Prussia has already demonstrated its leadership by defeating Austria. Austria doesn't have anything more that Prussia wants. So Bismarck basically just requests that the Austrians stay out of German affairs. And Bismarck doesn't take any of their territory. The Austrians say, okay, and it's for that reason that Austria will later ally with Germany towards the end of the 19th century. Finally, you have the big one. When you take AP Euro, and you should take AP Euro, you'll learn about all the shenaniganry that is involved with the causes of the Franco-Prussian War, the Ems dispatch, etc. But basically what happens is that Bismarck engineers a situation where France declares war on Prussia, and France looks like the aggressor. So all the German states rally to Prussia's defense, and the Prussian army quickly mobilizes. They mobilize within mere weeks. They march on France, and, France is not a military pushover around this time period. French jokes aside, the French army during this time period was professional. It had seen a lot of action and combat. The Prussian army had fought in wars, but they were usually wars of very short duration. So nobody was really sure what was going to happen. Also, the French army had a lot of modern equipment, including some of the first bolt-action rifles. So it was sort of a toss-up as to who would win. The Prussians were just better at maneuvering their forces. And so not only do they completely surround the French army at a place called Sedan, they also capture French Emperor Napoleon III. Now, Bismarck kind of assumes that with the capture of Napoleon III, the French will seek terms. Well, what happens is that after the capture of Napoleon, the French government in Paris basically replies that they don't want him anyway, and they overthrow the government and create a third republic. And the war goes on for quite some time. Prussian forces are eventually forced to shell Paris into a state of almost destitution. But France eventually sues for terms in the Treaty of Frankfurt, which does two things. One, it gives the territory of Alsace and Lorraine to Germany, seen right here. France also has to pay a major indemnity. But really, that's not as important as what happens to the German states, because the German states decide to formally unify under Prussian leadership, and the state of Germany is created, with King Wilhelm I of Prussia becoming emperor, or Kaiser Wilhelm I of the German Empire. British Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli calls this the German Revolution, and he says it's a revolution just as significant as the French Revolution. And there's a good reason for that. So the German Revolution, German unification, leads to the very thing that Europeans were worried about: a united Germany that's large, that's powerful, and that's militaristic. And so the European powers start looking for allies because the balance of power of Europe has been broken. And so France especially will spend the next generation looking for any reason whatsoever to go to war with Germany to get back its sacred territory. And France gets it. Except be careful what you wish for, because France gets it in this little war known as World War I.